Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Tuesday, August 8th, 2017. There's an expanding media empire in the United States with virulent right-wing content. And the Trump FCC is greasing the way for them to expand almost double the size permitted by law. Now, I want to credit John Oliver, the HBO host on Sunday nights. Last Week Tonight, I think, is the name of his show. And he's funny, but he always has a serious undercurrent to his show. And recently, he helped expose the virulent content that is produced centrally by the Sinclair Broadcast Group at a warehouse-style facility outside Baltimore and distributed to their television stations across the country. And the stations are instructed that they must run certain content, including far-right commentaries from people who used to work in the Trump administration and really ugly attacks on liberals. Now, if you think that Fox News is bad, and it is, this is 6 to 8 to 10 times worse, partly because these elements are inserted into local television news. So as you get the latest murder story or corruption of a local official, they weave in these messages, and to an uneducated viewer, it all just seems like the news. And the average viewer doesn't question whether the person presenting that news is in their market, in their locality, or is being wheeled in from somewhere else. So the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, last year, while Obama was still in office, they tossed out an old rule called the UHF discount. And you probably never heard of this, and you probably never want to hear of it again. But in the old days, when we had rabbit ears instead of cable, there was a big difference between the VHF channels that were on 2 to 14 on your TV set and the UHF channels that were 15 and higher. And those higher frequency stations required much bigger transmitters, and they didn't have either efficient or effective coverage of many of the cities that they were located in. So these were second-class facilities. And with the rise of cable, the digitization of broadcast signals, UHF doesn't matter anymore. And you have stations that are nominally on the UHF portion of the dial, but they have audiences bigger than the old VHF stations that have lower channels. And so the playing field is relatively level. And when the Tom Wheeler FCC threw out the UHF discount last year, it was quite sensible. It's like, it's as obsolete as a dial telephone. So, why this matters is that Sinclair, which is already the largest single owner of local television stations in the U.S., wants to buy 42 more to add to the 170 that it already owns. These 42 stations are currently owned by Tribune Media, the Chicago Tribune company, and they're in big markets, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. And if Tribune is acquired by Sinclair and the deal goes through, Sinclair will be reaching 72% of the households in the United States. Now, the problem with that is that the law says that there is a cap. No single entity can own stations reaching more than 39% of U.S. households. And Fox abides by that rule. NBC, CBS, ABC, they all live within those limits. But Sinclair wants to apply the UHF discount. Even still, at present, they're at 38%. Just 1 point under the national cap. And Ajit Pai, who is a loyalist Republican, who is the chair of the FCC, is working very hard to grease the skids for this deal to go through. And we're hearing very little opposition. Maureen Bradley Lazo emailed me a link to a petition, and I signed it today. But you would think that other corporate media operators like NBC, CBS, ABC would be making a big noise about this, saying, wait, this is unfair. This is going to put us at a competitive disadvantage. And I can't tell you actually why they have been so silent. I mean, really, John Oliver has been the leader in exposing Sinclair, the ugly programming it runs, which violates many standards, whether they're journalistic or regulatory. And it was the D.C. Court of Appeals that reviewed this issue and ruled in favor of Ajit Pai's FCC in reinstating the UHF discount. Now, I still don't see how the UHF discount allows you to just credit 50% of the number of households in that market toward the cap. But even if they use the so-called UHF discount, they're going to be way over the limit, faster than Who Shot Bob. So we've got to watch this carefully. This is a very critical problem. And as you know, I came out of the talk radio business. And over the years, with the rise of Rush Limbaugh and all these right-wing shows, the failure of Air America and other efforts to balance talk radio, it's now entirely right-wing. They're really just variations of how far right each subsequent host will be. No liberals, no centrists, no academics, people who just want to take a balanced approach are permitted in talk radio today. It's all just flamethrowers who are there to stir up trouble and to promote Trump's agenda. And so we have lost control of our media in this country, both philosophically. As many as 60 million people a day tune into right-wing talk radio. And the lies that I hear coming from Limbaugh, especially when they start to talk about liberals, they claim they know all about us. And it's just cartoon bullshit that they spew. And there is no corrective. There is no show that comes on later that says, by the way, Rush Limbaugh was full of shit when he said that earlier today. None. And this is a reason why Trump was able to reach out to his voters, because they're not reading the New York Times, they're not watching 60 Minutes. They're looking at Breitbart on their phone, they're listening to Limbaugh and Mark Levin and Michael Savage. And it does shape their reality in ways that are very dangerous for our country. There's a conference going on right now in Philadelphia of state insurance commissioners, and they're having a hell of a time in the city of brotherly love because they've been debating what to do, trying to predict whether the Trump administration will cut subsidies paid to the insurance companies on behalf of millions of low-income users of Obamacare. And Trump is not really very clear about this. These payments have been going on this year on a month-to-month basis. And this scares the hell out of the insurance companies. And I don't have much sympathy for insurance companies to start with, but I do understand that they need predictability in order to set rates and to offer coverage. They don't have predictability, so they are withdrawing coverage. Anthem is pulling out of Nevada. They're pulling out of parts of Wisconsin. And in some areas, there is only one insurance carrier available under the Affordable Care Act. In a few places, there are zero. This is by design. This is the Republican plan. Since they were unable to overtly repeal Obamacare, they are going to covertly scheme, plot, and do whatever they can to kill it. Trump administration officials were invited to speak to the state insurance regulators, but they didn't bother to show up. And the amount in question here is $7 to $10 billion a year, and the insurance companies will be permitted by state regulators in most cases to tack on surcharges if Trump and his administration do, in fact, reduce or eliminate these subsidy payments. And One, let's see, this guy is the Deputy Insurance Commissioner in Wisconsin, J.P. Wieske. Not whiskey, Wieske. And Wieske said consumers could be stuck in a zombie plan. An insurer that is essentially no longer able to do business in the worst-case scenario, or consumers may have to move to another insurer with different health care providers. There's also the issue that House Republicans in 2014 challenged these subsidy payments in a lawsuit saying that they were not provided for in the Affordable Care Act. And currently, a court of appeals for the District of Columbia is holding that case in abeyance at the request of the Trump administration and House Republicans. And so this is an untenable situation. Millions of people are at risk for losing their health insurance or having the costs jacked up in an unconscionable manner. And all of this is because the Republicans want to kill Obama's, what they see as Obama's legacy. And it comes back to the media messages put out by Sinclair and Fox and all those right-wing radio shows. There are too many people who believe the disinformation and outright lies that are fed to them on a daily basis. There's an interesting profile in the New York Times today of Mike Pompeo, who is Trump's new CIA director. And as I read it, I thought of Mel Goodman in our recent interview about his book, CIA Whistleblower. And he talks about how he publicly opposed the confirmation of Robert Gates as CIA director in 1992 because Gates had politicized the intelligence about Russia. And so Mike Pompeo recently at the Aspen Security Forum, and he said, look, this is the 19th time you all have asked about Russian interference in the presidential election. And the reporter corrected his notion. It was only the fourth question he had received, and he sits atop an agency that has asserted that Russia manipulated our election, hacked the DNC, and blah, 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 but he works for a guy who doesn't believe that. So how does he square that? Well, he kisses up, and he plays politics, and he personally delivers the daily briefing to the president, and apparently only goes to Langley, the CIA headquarters, in the afternoon. And he's a Tea Party guy, a Koch brothers, I want to say bought and paid for, but let's just say that he's real friendly with the Koch brothers. He came out of Wichita, and they see eye to eye on things. And so when pressed, he said, oh, yeah, it's true that Russians meddled in the election, and the one before that, and the one before that. They've been at this for a hell of a long time, and I don't think they have any intention of backing off. I don't know what that really means. It's not very definitive. But watch this guy. He's dangerous, he's political, and he will use the CIA as an instrument for Trump. He is that kind of loyalist. He probably got the same questions that Jim Comey got about being loyal. And while I'm not a big fan of Jim Comey, we know he rejected Trump's efforts to demand loyalty, and I would presume that Mike Pompeo did not respond in the same way. We're just learning that in July, 2 staff members of the House Intelligence Committee traveled to London and tried to contact the former British intelligence officer, Christopher Steele, who we're told was the guy who wrote the dirty dossier about Trump and Russia and the golden shower scenes. And there's a lot more to it than the golden showers, but that's what everybody remembers. Well, the 2 staffers turned up unannounced at the offices of Chris Steele's lawyers, and the former MI6 officer was reportedly in the building. Now, what is surprising here is that Adam Schiff, who is the ranking Democrat, and his Republican counterpart, who's named Conrovy, I think, he's from Texas, and the 2 of them are nominally in charge of the investigation into Trump-Russia. Mike Conaway is the correct name I was looking for. This is because Devin Nunes said he would recuse himself and step aside from the Russia investigation. But from what we can tell, the authorization for these 2 intelligence staffers to travel to London was approved by Damon Nelson, who is a Nunes guy. He worked for Nunes as his chief of staff and then was moved over to the committee which Nunes chairs in 2015. Now, this suggests that recusal doesn't mean anything in Washington today. It doesn't mean anything to Jeff Sessions. It doesn't mean anything to Devin Nunes. And while we really didn't find out what they found out on the trip to London, just the fact that it was done in the manner that it occurred is troubling. Joe Laria is a reporter I have a lot of respect for, and he's been a guest on this program many times, most recently to talk about his book called Why I Lost by Hillary Clinton. And today at Consortium News, he's published a recap of the recent developments in the Seth Rich murder case, linked to possible collaboration or involvement in the leaking of material from DNC servers to WikiLeaks. And as you know, last week I got a hold of the audio recording of the phone call with Seymour Hersh, the legendary and aging investigative reporter. And laced with his profanity and kind of self-interruptions, we heard Cy Hersh tell us that young Seth Rich did in fact transfer information to WikiLeaks, and he asked for money. And while Cy Hersh says that the murder of Seth Rich was not payback for his leaking, it was, he believes, a botched attempt at robbery in the early morning hours of a Sunday in Washington, D.C., the comments from Hersh have raised a lot of eyebrows. And we've heard Caitlin Johnstone say that, look, if he knows something, he should tell us. Well, Joe Laria was able to email Cy Hersh, and Hersh did confirm that that was his voice in the recording we heard. It wasn't in much doubt, but Hersh has confirmed it by objecting to the way it was recorded and released. And according to Laria, he really didn't comment further, even though questions were asked. Hersh has given no indication he's planning to write a piece based on his source, who he said has seen the FBI report. And so we're kind of at a standstill right now, where there does appear to be interesting angles of investigation, but nobody really seems willing to investigate. And we're all told that if you raise questions about Seth Rich, that you're a conspiracy theorist, and you're going to go to hell or something like that. Every day I like to pause for a second and thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Sandra Fish, Jason Spitzer, Joe Carson, and Steve Burke. He just set up a new annual subscription. Thank you, Steve. I think I know that guy. So if you're so inclined, I'd love to get your support. I mentioned yesterday that my aging mixer console here, the mixing board, is frying. And I have ordered a new one. It's going to cost about $500, and Faith Peoples has already stepped up and offered to help cover part of that. If you'd like to help, you can go to the sign-up page at peterbcollins.com, and at the very bottom it says, look, if you want to make a one-time contribution, just send it to PayPal, linked to the email peter@peterbcollins.com. And if you would like to help out in that manner, I would be very grateful. I also would appreciate it if you take out a monthly subscription for $5, $10, or $20. That's what helps pay the bills and keep the podcasts rolling. Well, today I'm releasing to my subscribers a fascinating new look at the Veterans Healthcare Administration and the efforts in Washington to create the illusion that the VHA is a failure and that the answer is privatization. Suzanne Gordon has been covering healthcare issues as a reporter and author for more than 30 years, and her new book, The Battle for Veterans Healthcare, is subtitled Dispatches from the Front Lines of Policymaking and Patient Care. In the interview, you'll hear Suzanne and three people who have benefited from the health care provided at the Veterans Healthcare Administration. And here's an excerpt from my conversation with Suzanne Gordon, where she answers my question, who would profit from privatization of the VA?
The VA has a $65-70 billion plus budget, and the Veterans Health Administration. And the people who will profit are private sector doctors, healthcare systems, medical equipment companies, pharmaceutical companies, because the VA negotiates with pharmaceutical companies for better drug prices. The VA doctors and nurses and professionals are not on salaries, so they have no incentive to overtreat. And private sector doctors, of course, on fee-for-service have a huge incentive. And VHA healthcare is much more cost-effective. In fact, they've done studies that show that the costs, if you were to transfer just 60% of eligible veterans to the private sector, would quadruple. It could be as much as $450 billion. I mean, so there are a lot of people out there with their hands, open and grabbing and wanting some of this moolah,
I invite you to listen to the full interview with Suzanne Gordon, available for subscribers today at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spreaker, you know the places. Well, Rahm Emanuel is a guy I've never cared for. He was a member of Congress who recruited all the conservatives that helped Nancy Pelosi become Speaker. Then he became Obama's White House Chief of Staff, and he stiff-armed people who wanted to really shut down Guantanamo. And Rahm Emanuel is now the mayor of his hometown, Chicago. And he is properly resisting the efforts of the federal government to crack down on Chicago and other places for adopting sanctuary policies, saying that local police will not be an arm of ICE and round up immigrant suspects for deportation. And the city is asking a judge to throw out new Justice Department rules that would make Chicago ineligible to apply for grants unless it agrees to give federal immigration authorities full access to its police stations and provide 48 hours notice before releasing people who are wanted by immigration agents. Now, this has caused a little, it's not on Twitter, gratefully, thankfully, but by press release, Jeff Sessions pushed back. And he said that Chicago's high murder rate is a problem and that it's caused to a degree perhaps unsurpassed by any other jurisdiction because they have chosen deliberately and intentionally to adopt a policy that obstructs this country's lawful immigration system. Now, Chicago has an ugly murder rate. Over 400 people have been killed there this year. And last year, I think it was over 600. But there is no indication that it is undocumented immigrants who are responsible for even a portion of the street killings in Chicago. Regrettably, it is mostly black-on-black gang and drug-related crime. And so Jeff Sessions doesn't know what he's talking about. And it's obvious that he is flailing, trying to find some way to demonize Chicago. And as you know, I support sanctuary city policies. I think they're just sensible from the local perspective. Meanwhile, Jeffrey Beauregard Jim Crow Sessions III has ordered the Justice Department to reverse its position in a high-profile voting case in Ohio. The Obama administration had filed a brief against the Secretary of State of Ohio's action to purge the voter rolls of people who hadn't voted recently. And the Justice Department has now reversed its position, and it is arguing that the purges of voters are legal under federal law. The Ohio procedure allows the state to purge voters meeting certain criteria for being inactive. If you haven't cast a ballot in 2 years, you're sent a notice asking to confirm registration, and if the voter doesn't respond and doesn't cast a ballot over the next 4 years, the person is removed from the rolls. But I believe that there is no basis for these kinds of restrictions, and that if you want to register once and vote every 30 years, that is your right. And so one critic here, this is Kristen Clark, Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, says the law hasn't changed since the department accurately told the court that Ohio's voter purge was unlawful. The facts haven't changed. Only the leadership of the Justice Department has changed, and this action opens the door for wide-scale, unlawful purging of the voter registration rolls across the country. Now let's take a look at the coverage of Venezuela. If you look at the New York Times today, They are cheering for a coup. Quote, Venezuela has a history of coup and attempted overthrows at times of crisis, and many in the country now wonder if this is one of those times. Many? And who did you talk to? What poll do you base that on? This is the kind of editorialized coverage that we're seeing on a regular basis. And what I see is comparable to what we saw about Greece 2 years ago. Every story was about how the socialist government was a failure and that they had to accept the austerity program imposed by German banks. There was very little coverage sympathetic to the plight of the Greek situation and the Greek people. So today's story in the New York Times uses a kind of unidentified time lapse where they compress events that have occurred over months and make it seem like they've all occurred in recent days. And they create the perception that the Maduro government is just completely corrupt and that it's holding on to power because of the way it has created cronyism with the leaders of the military. They note that on a single day, President Nicolas Maduro promoted 195 officers to the rank of general, and that 23 state governors, 11 of them are current or retired generals. And so they're painting the picture that the military continues to support Maduro, and as long as that's the case, he will hold on to power. But there's a really ugly video on the New York Times website today where they promote this apparent Venezuelan opponent of the government who's in a kind of Darth Vader outfit, and he's holding an assault weapon, and he's threatening from a remote location where he's shooting this video to start a revolution. And so corporate media in the United States, they are openly promoting the idea of a coup d'etat in Venezuela. Over advice, they report on the UN and how the UN is claiming that the leadership there is responsible for widespread and systemic use of excessive force. And they blame the government for all of the deaths. And as we heard from Dan Kovalik, who was there as an election observer just 10 days ago, much of the violence is coming from the opposition. Now, I'm not in a position here in California to say what percentage of the violence is from the government and what percent is from the opposition. But when I hear it reported in media outlets that it's entirely from the government, then I have to say, well, that does not square with eyewitness accounts. Now, I want to commend The Guardian from London today because they have produced an article that offers a different perspective. It is a longtime revolutionary named Avila, who was part of the Chavez Revolution in 1998, and who remains loyal to Chavez and to Maduro. And they talk about this thing that was hyped by the New York Times, where at a military base, a handful of soldiers tried to stage a takeover, and they were run off, but a handful of them got away with some weapons. Well, Avila says the attack was nothing but a media show, put on by mercenaries and paramilitaries commanded by an officer who deserted, a traitor and coward linked to the same right wing that we rose up against. Now, this is refreshing. You cannot find that perspective in any mainstream media outlet in the United States. The article goes on to cite the prospect that the Maduro government will retain power because of the strong military support for Maduro. And what's interesting about this article is that it doesn't reference the socialist nature of the government of Cuba. That's a rare slight that they decided not to use. And, of course, they also don't provide the context about the low worldwide oil prices, which are the major cause for Venezuela's economic problems. Now to North Korea, where Donald Trump is operating in a very dangerous way. Today, while he is allegedly on a working vacation at his golf club in New Jersey, he retweeted a report that came from Fox and Friends that was based on anonymous sources that said that U.S. spy satellites had detected North Korea loading 2 cruise missiles on a patrol boat on the country's coast in recent days. Now, that is exposure of American surveillance capabilities. And Trump, apparently oblivious or just arrogantly oblivious, decided that he wanted to retweet this. Now, the White House didn't comment. They didn't say that this confirms that the report is accurate. But one official who was not authorized to speak publicly was chagrined that Trump would retweet a report about something unimportant that nonetheless reveals something about our surveillance capabilities. One of the other big issues is that Trump, Mike Pence, Rexon Tillerson, and UN Ambassador Nikki Haley are not singing from the same hymnal. And the confusion over our actual attitude and policies toward North Korea is becoming a problem. Tillerson has said that the U.S. is willing to open talks if North Korea halts its missile tests. Mike Pence said that the administration is not seeking engagement and that previous attempts had failed miserably. And over at the UN, Nikki Haley is trying to promote the UN sanctions that were passed, and so they're really just all over the place. And my friend Joe Cirincione, president of the Plowshares Fund, said that is really a new level of unreality. It would be funny if the consequences weren't so catastrophic. We have openings. You have to hand it to Nikki Haley. The new Security Council measures go much further, but where's the rest of the plan? There's a deep state of incoherence on North Korea. I don't think there are many in the administration whose intention it is to start a new Korean war, but there are many who could stumble onto one. And that's my big fear. And on the announcement today that our analysts at the Defense Intelligence Administration, or agency, believe that North Korea now has a small nuke that could be mounted on one of these ICBMs that they've been testing, Trump has responded saying that we will threaten them with fire and fury. And this is reckless, it's dangerous, it is warmongering. And it's as if Trump needs to prove his manhood by getting involved in a skirmish with North Korea. But a skirmish could lead to a massive regional conflict. And it's not something we should take lightly. The latest leak from Washington came from somebody in the federal agencies, 13 of which have completed a draft report by scientists related to climate change. This is described as a sweeping report that does say many lines of evidence demonstrate that human activities, especially emissions of greenhouse gases, are primarily responsible for recent observed climate change. This new assessment, which is consistent with past reporting, is, of course, anathema to the Trump administration and their little boy at the EPA, Scott Pruitt. So it remains to be seen what tactics will be used to try to water down this report or prevent its release. But over at the Agriculture Department, there's a new memo that tells employees not to use the terms climate change or weather extremes. Climate change should be changed to, you're just not allowed to use it. But you can talk about weather extremes. Instead of climate change adaptation, staff are asked to use resilience to weather extremes. The term reduce greenhouse gases is blacklisted in favor of build soil organic matter, increase nutrient use efficiency. Orwell, where are you when we need you? And this is kind of Orwellian. Vice News is reporting today that almost as often as Dr. Pepper recommends a soft drink, the media team at the White House delivers to Trump once, sometimes twice a day, a thick folder of happy news, of good news, positive news about the Trump administration, screenshots of his picture being depicted on television, and the staff gets tired of all this. The feedback they get on it, it needs to be more fucking positive. And some of them have taken to referring to the packet as the propaganda document. I guess that's what it takes to prop up the sagging ego of our insecure, narcissistic tweeter, you know, him.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.